Hi, everyone. This is our last installment of the first round of webinars that we've put on through ClimateX. And in no way does this represent the end of anything, because we got every intention to continue with some sort of webinars or just mode of engagement so that we can keep presenting all the interesting stuff that's going on here at MIT and find ways to reach out to everybody else out there who's been engaged with the ClimateX website. So my name is Mark Brown. I'm working with the Office of Digital Learning, and this webinar, Rajesh is going to give us a chance to introduce you to Chris. But just wanted to let everybody know that the Office of Digital Learning is very committed to, yeah, so withdrawal symptoms already, says Robert. Yeah, so we're going to keep going with this, and we're going to probably reinvent the model a little bit and try to get some different ways of reaching out to our audiences and engaging with you. We're going to make some significant improvements to the website, and we're already thinking about what phase 2 of the product will look like. So all of that said, let's get started.
Thanks, Mark. I mean, the concept of the last of the first, I mean, that's a complex concept, right? But we are on the last webinar of the first ClimateX Hive, and our speaker is Chris Nidel. He's in DC. Chris is also one of the co-founders of the MIT Alumni for Climate Action Leadership, along with Dave Damlor and Britta Voss and Quentin Zondervan, who have all been speakers this webinar series. And actually, Dave has not been. But I want to welcome Chris because he has put his money where his mouth is, or maybe his mouth where his money is, by choosing an environmental career over a career that was potentially more closely tied to the fossil fuel industry. So Chris, tell us a little bit about yourself and where you're coming from and where you are and where you're going.
So hi everyone. As Rajesh said, my name's Chris Nidel. As Rajesh said, my background's in chemical engineering. So I've got a master's degree in chemical engineering from MIT. I did my undergraduate work at the University of Virginia. And after I left graduate school at MIT, I went to work for one of the big pharmaceutical companies, still one of the big pharmaceutical companies, probably one of the top 5 in the world right now. And I worked there for a few years doing chemical process and development. So I worked on drugs that were for HIV, for Parkinson's, for cholesterol, and some other drugs as well. And while I was working in that career, I realized that the company's values and the things that I was doing, both to help the company and the things that the company was doing in terms of the big picture of human health, but also in terms of the environment, was not consistent with my values. And so I left and went to law school. And since that time, I have a law practice where I do mostly environmental law. I've done cases with respect to groundwater contamination, from oil refineries, from fracking operations, from all kinds of other, chemical plants. And I represent people that are sick and injured, either their property's been impacted or their health's been impacted from some of those exposures.
Excellent. So this is as good a time as any to talk about those, tell us a little bit about one of those cases that you have fought tirelessly on behalf of the public.
Okay, so I actually have a few slides. I've given some presentations. If I can figure out how to share my screen to you all, which I think I can work out here. I've done, I'm going to go through a couple of these slides. Let's see. Can you see my screen? Okay, so this is adapted from a presentation that I gave with respect to career choices and making a change of careers with respect to sort of ethics and the environment, ethics and environmental issues. And so the first question that I sort of put up here, and I know it violates all rules of PowerPoint presentations, but when I was in college a long time ago, I didn't have time to take philosophy classes because I was studying chemical engineering. So I was pretty much only allowed to take engineering classes. But I heard those that had the flexibility to take those classes, they would talk about this Plato's cave. And still not sure I know exactly what Plato's cave is, but I think it has something to do with, decision making and deciding what's right for the greater good, and how to value our choices and what we do to choose for the greater good versus individual good. And so with that idea, I have some questions and I like people to think about when they think about their career. And so I sort of start with, this idea of whether companies have moral responsibilities. And if they do, what are their moral responsibilities? So when people think about their careers and their career choices, whether they're starting a career or whether they're mid-career and they want to make a change, or whether they're, facing their first retirement and they want to make a change to a new career, is there a moral responsibility that these companies or organizations have? Do they have ethical responsibilities? Putting aside morals, are there ethical principles that should guide these companies? Or is the only obligation that they follow the law? And then finally, you hear this a lot, is their only obligation to increase profits for shareholders? And so, I would contrast that with, those same type of questions for individuals. So I think we would all probably agree that each of us has some moral code, and if not a moral code, then certainly an ethical code. And so what are those morals and ethics that we as individuals follow? And then, you can, for some people that would take a religious tone as well. So somewhere in there, we each have either moral, ethical, or religious, or a blend of all three. Some responsibilities that go above and beyond and may differ from just an obligation to follow the law. And so, that leads us to this question as individuals, putting aside what our obligations are and what the laws are. What do we expect from ourselves as individuals, and what do we expect from each other? How do we want others to see us and to understand our values from our actions? And so you take all of these things and you put them in the context of your career and the company or the organization that you work for. And it becomes challenging to ask those questions when you're looking at those answers that you've given individually, and you apply those same standards to the company or the organization that you're working for. And so to tell you a little bit about my new career, one of the issues that I have dealt with that relates in some ways directly, in some ways indirectly to climate change is hydrofracking or hydraulic fracturing, or just fracking, as you may have heard it discussed in the press and through activist groups and other things. But here's a slide. This is just this doesn't relate to my case, but it relates to the magnitude of fracking that we have in this country. This is out in the Midwest, and you can see each one of these light spots is a drill pad, and so there's a huge impact in terms of energy production, in terms of environmental contamination, and then in terms of climate changing releases of methane that are quite significant, both in terms of releases from the drilling operations, releases from the pipelines, and then ultimately the burning and consuming of these fossil fuels. And so this next slide is a picture actually of a case that I filed in Texas, one of the first cases involving fracking in the country. And I represented the people that lived in the house. I'm not sure if you can see my pointer, but the people that lived in the house in the bottom left portion of the photo here. And what was interesting is that this is all their land. This was their horse farm, and so they had multiple acres of a horse farm here. I think it was 11 acres, and all of this land is theirs that they've invested their life savings in, that they were raising horses on. And the people that I represented, they left for work one day, and early in the morning, 7 a.m, left for work, and the company was watching their property, had sort of staked things out for a while. And after they left for work, they came in, they cut down their fence, they let their horses go wild, and they brought some drilling rigs onto the property and started drilling. So, a few hundred feet from the front of their house, they had a drilling rig. They had, ultimately at one point, they had a big frac waste pit. So they took, a better part of their land. They destroyed their horse pen. They destroyed their horse operation that they had there. They cut down their fence, like I said, and they had a 24-hour industrial operation on their property to drill, to frack, and then to produce natural gas in their front yard. And so we filed a case for this intrusion. The interesting thing that most people don't understand is that the difference between conventional oil and gas development is that for the most part, it happens on company lands, or it happens on public lands, or it happens offshore. With fracking, you have people in Pennsylvania, people in Texas, people in Oklahoma that already own the surface. So they own the surface of the land. Unfortunately, for most of them, they don't own the mineral rights. And so the company obtained a lease for the mineral rights from the mineral rights owner, sort of unbeknownst to the landowner. So when we traditionally think of the person that owns the land, it's the family that I represented that were living on the surface of the land. And unfortunately for them, the mineral rights owner has what they say is a right to reasonable use of the surface to obtain the minerals that are below the surface. And so you look at this photo, and they defined reasonable use of the surfaces as taking, essentially half of their land. We don't see the drilling rig here, but for many, many months, there was the drilling rig there. There was 24-hour lighting on the property, keeping them and their children up at night, et cetera, et cetera. So it's quite an invasion, just of putting aside the environmental impacts, just of their property rights, their use and enjoyment of their land, that we would think would be, something protected and sacred, certainly in this country. And so, I represented that family, and I wanted to show you some other photos of the same type of operation. I've given lots of lectures on fracking throughout the country at various universities and some other places. And what I think people don't understand fundamentally is that there's a huge property issue, even before you get to whether it's impacting wells, whether it's people can light their wells on fire, whether it's causing other environmental contamination, and then ultimately whether it's causing an impact on climate change. It's taking away people's property. And so here again, you see people's homes that are in this slide, and to the side of their homes, they have waste pits. They have these huge industrial drilling operations. They have 24-hour traffic in and out with these massive trucks and diesel exhaust. Actually, you have two waste pits here. Here's another frac site. You have somebody that owned a farm. Now it's a huge industrial operation just outside their farm. I'm sure it's taken away their pastures and everything else here again. So these things are massive, and I have, used this litigation to try and slow down and try and curb the expansion of fracking in areas like Pennsylvania and Texas, and to try to bring the rights of those people that have, that obviously have some right to use and enjoy their property, to breathe clean air, to address this issue, which has, has greater impact in terms of the broader picture, which is, the climate impact, not just, again, from consuming fossil fuels, but from the releases of methane that we know now are quite significant. And in terms of climate change impacts, we know that the release of methane is extremely significant as compared even to the release of carbon dioxide, where methane has, anywhere from a 15 to 20 x and possibly more impact on the climate, per molecule it's emitted. And this is a photo that we took. We were driving through the country in Pennsylvania with the producers of Gasland, and this is a flaring operation at a frac site that was just immense. I mean, the picture doesn't do this justice. This is 5 huge flares, and you could feel, putting aside climate change and the heat that we all are experiencing in terms of the climate, this was a massive, you could feel this heat from these flames, hundreds of feet away, hundreds of yards away. And there were people living in their homes where I have to believe that their homes were, 5 and 10, 15 degrees hotter inside because of these massive flames. And you could actually, when we were watching, one of these flares went out, and they had to actually send someone up. You could hear the chemicals just exhausting into the environment when the flare was out, and they had to send someone up on a on a lift with essentially a big match to relight one of those flares. And it was just really, I mean, it's really just incredible that we go out into the countryside where there's little protections, there's little access to emergency vehicles and everything else, and you're out in the mountains and you see this massive industrial operation with these huge flames and all of that that's going on. I mean, this is kind of interesting. This is a FLIR camera, so it's an infrared camera that shows the emissions of contaminants, and these are storage tanks at frac sites, and you can see the clouds of VOCs, or volatile chemicals, that are just emitting from these tanks constantly. And certainly as you get into the hotter months, these tanks are just venting out to the atmosphere. So you don't just have impacts from the methane, you don't just have impacts into the groundwater, but you have these massive impacts into the air as well. This is a great photo from Ohio where you have this, a pretty high-end neighborhood with these, huge homes, and they've got new neighbors, which is, the industrial fracking operation near them. And, you can take a look out the window and that's the view that you didn't think that you had paid for, but now that you're getting. So anyway, so that's a little bit of a taste of the work that I do. Let me stop the screen share and get back. But to give you an idea of some of the other things that I do in terms of my current career, I represent people that are sick and injured from exposure. So I've sued, for example, BP and Chevron on behalf of people that have gotten leukemia from exposure to drinking water and airborne contaminants from some of their operations. I've represented people that have leukemia. I don't know if anyone has seen the sinkhole down in Florida, but some of these massive phosphate operations where they have radioactive waste that are leaking into the groundwater. I've represented people there. I've represented people that were exposed to PCBs actually up in Massachusetts. So there's historical contaminants, there's sort of current contaminants, and it's all in an effort really to try and prevent these types of exposures in the future and try and force these companies to internalize some of their external costs. And when you think of that concept in the big picture, one of the things that we're looking at, and one of the things that I've been working with some other lawyers on, is trying to force companies to internalize the cost of climate change. So, it's not a very easy issue to fit into a simple lawsuit, but it's something where certainly whether you look at the coal producing or coal burning companies, these coal-fired power plants, you look at Exxon Mobil, you look at some of these oil producing companies, they're certainly having an effect, and what I think we would all agree, and our children and grandchildren will agree, is an unreasonable effect on all of our lives. The problem is that it's a very disparate impact. So you have a lot of people that are contributing to that effect. And so we're looking at ways to strategize and try and force these companies to internalize their piece of the pie or their piece of this impact. And so that's certainly one of the things that it's on my radar, and something that I'm trying to use the law to approach and to try and create some solutions for. So with that, I'll turn it back to Rajesh.
Thanks, Chris, for this great overview and of the really interesting legal issues, because as you said, there are property rights issues here that are perhaps in parallel to, and maybe even more legally enforceable than environmental or climate related litigation. So I'm going to do a dual track back and forth with you for a few minutes. One is really how you got into this career, and talk a little bit about how the MIT education you had before helped you with that. And secondly, tell us a little bit about just the legal landscape, because I think one of the questions that all of us have, especially maybe with the new administration now, is, can the law be a protector because the government may not be?
So those are two very loaded questions, and I'll take the first one. I think the first one is enough to talk about for a second anyway. So when I was working at the pharmaceutical company, I mean, it sort of relates back to those questions that I put up at the beginning of my slides. Is I was working at a company that I thought, my job was essentially to help human health. And, while I was doing a small part of that, I saw the bigger picture is I was really trying to save lives. And what I realized in that, with respect to pharmaceutical company that I was working at, and I think generally the pharmaceutical industry, that you realize that their main objective is not really about saving lives or human health. It's about the bottom line. It's about making money. It's about the next blockbuster drug that will sell for billions of dollars. And so that was one issue. The other issue that relates more directly to the path that I ultimately chose is that I was seeing people in my workplace that were getting sick. And so I was seeing a very direct interaction between the environment, I mean, our local environment, being workplace exposures, people that were being exposed to chemicals, on the job, and health outcomes. So there were people that were coming into work really week after week that were reporting, symptoms, a lump in the stomach, a lump in their throat, blood in their urine, for example, that ultimately were being diagnosed with cancer. I had a friend that was early 20s that was diagnosed with a brain tumor. I had people that I worked with who were diagnosed with leukemia and lymphoma. And a lot of those things seemed to be related to the work that they were doing, and particularly the chemicals that they were exposed to on the job. And so, I was really put into a position where, if we talk about, MIT and how that education helped me, the way I've always described my MIT education, and I think it's in some ways it's a blessing and a curse, but I think it's really helped me, and I think it has a lot of potential to help anyone that graduates with the kind of education that I got from MIT, at least, is that, MIT taught me by essentially putting me in a box that had no exit, right? They put me into a room that had no doors and windows, and they said, you need to find a way out, right? And there was not an obvious solution. There was, in fact, there may not be a solution at all, but you needed to be creative and try and approach it, sort of looking from high up, looking in very close detail, and trying to change your different angles of focus and change your perspective, and try and see if there was, in fact, some way to solve the problem. And so, when I was at the pharmaceutical company that I was at, I got to a point where my job was to look at data, and it was to see trends in data, and it was to see ways to improve the data for the company. And I was also seeing this data on people's health. And I could not help but, with my analytical mind and with, my problem solving skills that MIT was largely responsible for, that I could not avoid coming to at least the possible conclusion that the company was making people sick, and that, there was a direct result of people's exposures and people's work experience that was really impacting people's lives and unfortunately cutting some of their lives short. And so, I applied to law school, and I went to law school, and I sought to get into a situation that number one, that I was much more comfortable with, that I agreed with ethically, that I was okay with morally. To put it in pretty practical terms, during my exit interview with the company, they asked me why I was leaving. And at some point I told them, I'm not, I don't want to get overly personal, but at some point I said, I work here during the week and I get a paycheck, and on Sundays I go to church. And when I go to church on Sundays, I feel guilty about the work that I do during the week. And so, that's not where anyone should exist, right? I think a lot of people do exist there. I think probably a lot of people don't even think about what they do during the week when they show up to church on Sunday, or when they, when they think about the good that they've done or the things that they've done. Sort of, we tend to put that 8 or 10 or 12 hours of our career outside of the box of our ethics, outside of the box of our morals, and certainly outside of the box of our religious or our spiritual decision making. And I don't think, I don't think that's something that we should be doing. And certainly it's not something that I could do. And so I was forced, number one, to find a career that I could be okay with, but not just okay with. Then the next thing that I wanted to do was try and find a career that I could actually work to seek to address some of those things that I had seen within the company. So to address the environmental impacts that the company was having, to address the workplace and health impacts that the company was having, maybe not directly at that site with that company, but in those similar analogous situations across the country, where I might have an opportunity to represent people and try and bring about some impact. So I think that probably is a good answer and a place that I can stop as far as your first question, Rajesh.